What a day on the continent. Idriss Deby has been killed. That's not even the news. That was a president who not only led his people as a leader, but he was also leading from the front against the insurgents and rebels. Just as he got re-elected this time around, it would seem as if something has happened. The implication of what this will mean for countries around the Maghreb, more so Nigeria, is our main focus today on The Square. Welcome, I'm Sulaiman. You know, Chad, one of Africa's strongest militaries, has lost its president. Well, this is as devastating as it gets, as the former rebel leader is one of Africa's longest-serving presidents and toughest voices on security. Deby was reportedly killed by the Front for Change and Concord in Chad, the FCCC, a rebel group battling to achieve a regime change in the country. Battles have been ongoing between the FCCC and the Chadian Defense Force, the CDF, with the one which happened between 16 and 19th April, led by President Deby. The FCCC had previously said it was withdrawing, but with the president killed, the battle line may have been drawn even more clearly. Locals have died in millions across the continent, but with the death of a president, the daredevils may have sent a sterner message. Africa needs an instant response and must fight insecurity headlong. That's our conversation. I'm now being joined by Jasmine, Opperman, researcher, Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project in South Africa, and Oha Akigbe, intelligence analyst. And pretty much later, Kabir Adamu, security expert, will be joining me later on the show. But this time, Oha and Jasmine, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Suleiman. It's great to be here.
Let me start first with Oha. Your country, Nigeria, is one of the countries many are looking towards at the moment, knowing full well that the incursion of the bandits and terrorists have always been seen to be coming, some of them, from Chad. What does the killing of Idriss Deby mean to Africa's fight against insecurity?
Well, I guess the facts remain to be seen where this is going to lead us to. For Nigeria, when I last checked, we were number 3 on the Global Terrorism Index, and so the stakes have been quite high. We're battling on several fronts. Chad, Niger, these have been areas of great concern to our own national security. We've had a lot of incursions from these areas, and there's been a long battle over the last probably 25 years trying to create some form of stability. So this gives me some concern, and we're really going to have to see how we can try to read all the narratives that play out from this point on. In terms of securing the borders, we're really going to have to, again, work our strategy. Our military forces have been upgrading over the last few years. I don't think we've ever had an operational efficiency in our services like we have now. And the reasons are obvious. The challenge is more than ever before. But then again, this is a new challenge that's coming to us. Potentially, we might not be able to do an immediate assessment, but it does give me a lot of concern going forward.
Let me bring in Jasmine here. You're an expert in armed conflict on the continent. Looking at what has happened, do you think this has anything to do with some of those pockets of mercenaries in Libya?
I think there is absolutely no doubt. If one looks at the composition of the rebel groups now, on their Facebook page, immediately releasing a statement that this rebel group, supported by certain factions of Haftar, that we had certain extremist players at play out of Libya into Chad, cannot be ignored. But I think what is also important to understand is he's standing at a diplomatic level. the role he played, not only upwards north towards Libya, but also in terms of Mali and the Sahel. Chad had a tremendous influence. The president, sadly passing away, had a very strong voice that to a certain extent carried a voice of credibility and a voice that influenced even international role players such as France, the United States, Israel. And that voice is gone. We are talking about an old guard leader with vast experience in the continent and how to deal with these matters. And it is simply not there anymore. And with the military immediately stepping in, closing borders, a young son taking over, alarm bells are ringing. There is no way that this can be an isolated to Chad. I think we're going to see a ripple effect to the west, to the north, and we can even expect to the south. There are serious concerns, as indicated by the other guest speaker, and this is a gap that is not going to be easily filled.
Okay, listening to Jasmine, she's painted a very grim picture because love him or hate him, late President Idriss Deby was a force to reckon with in the fight against insurgents. And as she's put it, she said across, geopolitical zones on the continent, this would seem big trouble. What message does this pose to other leaders on the continent?
Pointed out, we're going to require a lot of diplomatic activity, a lot more cooperation. I mean, we do have a joint task force in place that's been working for quite a while, but at the diplomatic level, we're definitely going to have to see a lot more activity, identifying, new threats that might be emerging from this occurrence. And I think we really need to be concerned, and people really need to start talking immediately, as soon as possible.
Jasmine, Chad is strongly supported, as highlighted by you, by the French. And also, if you looked at it closely, even by the American government as well. So it's probably the first time any president will die in battle in a very long time. How does this news settle? Do you suspect something is amiss?
Look, we need to understand that the president has always been one, not scared of moving to the battle lines, not being upfront with his soldiers, and that he was hurt during previous visits to these battlefronts, also well recorded. So the fact that he was killed, sadly, now during this incident, is not an outlier. This has been part of the president and his makeup. But what is important here is how he negotiated French, US, Israel influence in that region, because there was always pressure on these international role players in terms of human rights adherences by the security forces within Chad. And nevertheless, he maintained good relations. He knew how to play and how to talk to international states, and also positioning Chad strongly in the fight, for instance, against the Islamic State West Africa with a multinational joint task force. And that is all attributed to a diplomatic intervention that is then followed by the strong military of Chad. And the concern now is, how is the military going to respond to the situation? Will they support the new young leader, which actually goes against the constitution of Chad? Then we sit with another problem, because we're talking about a rebel group, and where rebels we've seen in Ethiopia at play. We can go to South Sudan, how they will read the situation and how this could inspire them in terms of their confrontations they are involved in. So there are very direct and indirect consequences of utmost concern. Even Equatorial Guinea is a very good example of an old leader who able to keep it together. And the moment he goes, I'm afraid we are going to sit with a major problem. And this is what we and the AU will have to show now is an intervention that takes all these complexities into consideration and ensure that the region does not collapse further into instability.
This actually is very important. Both of you have highlighted this much, and that is why we're here, so that the region doesn't actually, dig deep into more chaos. Ohai, looking at the rise of rebels and the Islamic State in Africa, you would agree that this has actually greatly changed the scope of security on the continent. Can we measure the devastation, caused by these data-wise?
Well, what are you talking about here? Are you talking of the effect on the economy, or are we talking about losses?
We're looking at the effect of the Islamic, the ISIS, as well as these other terror groups within that region. Looking at what they've caused. It could be economically, politically, but as Jasmine said, if nothing is done, it just might plunge the region into more chaos.
Yeah, of course. I mean, look, the fact is that we've been dealing with these threats, and they seem to be becoming more complex every single year. So it's really difficult to be able to assess the entire effect. It's definitely having an effect on the economy of the region, because now, for instance, in Nigeria, we're having to allocate more and more funds to defense. And these funds that should be going to other areas like education and agriculture. And the question is, how long can we sustain security operations within Nigeria and within the sub-region as well? These are things that are really, really concerning, because some of these groups are aware that some of the nations in this region will not be able to sustain continuous security operations. And what could happen is some kind of implosion within the region. And that's a major concern as well.
And I'm sure, Jasmine, you also share that concern, as highlighted by Ohai, because it would mean how long is so long before any of these countries buck down?
I think it is, and I do agree with the speaker. I think there's another factor at play here that we simply cannot ignore, and that is the role of international role players on the African continent. When Biden came to power, everyone expected a honeymoon in terms of rebuilding and a change in strategy. I'm afraid, and I said that to a journalist, it's going to be a short-lived honeymoon. Sadly so, it turned out. If we look at foreign actors involved, and I'm talking Russia, China, Turkey, United States, France, and I'm talking across the region, Africa is caught up in an international power politics situation where international players uses the word Islamic State terrorism to their own benefit in terms of protecting their own interests and countering the influence of other international players with little respect and regard for Africans and for us living on the African continent. And this creates immense problems because you also sit with an African leadership in several countries that is simply not willing to address these fundamental issues as raised by the guest speaker, because that could lead to a change in the power structures within government, could impact on their positions and access to certain financial benefits. And this is the catch-22. And we in Africa must realize we need to stand up and address these matters ourselves. For the international role players have a different agenda at play here.
Ohai, do you think the continent has the wherewithal to push back these troublemakers, these groups trying to tear the continent apart, as highlighted by Jasmine? Because if you look at it, there are pockets of rebel groups across Africa, especially even in the East. So does Africa have the muscle to push back?
Well, you know what? We're going to have to find the wherewithal. That's the truth, because the alternative to that is chaos. So like Jasmine has pointed out, at the diplomatic level, there's going to have to be a lot of planning, a lot of discussions. But again, there's the quagmire of international politics, like she's pointed out, and even politics within the African region itself that we're going to have to wade through. Are we going to see people coming to the table without different agendas? Because this has been part of the problem over the years, where you have sub-agendas, and we cannot afford to play all these games at this point, because some of these groups are becoming more and more powerful. Their funding is increasing, their operational capacity is increasing, their ability to be able to recruit amidst all of the socioeconomic problems is getting greater and greater. So we do have to really press together to be able to come against these groups, because internally they're creating political problems, ethnic problems as well. So in Nigeria, for instance, you find out now that there's a widely held belief that there's some kind of Fulani agenda that cuts across some parts of West Africa. Now, this might not necessarily be true, but this is a narrative that is building. And what's the likely outcome of this, the consequence? We could have people falling apart, so you have ethnic nationalities going against each other. So we're definitely going to have to find the wherewithal. Do we have the capacity? Yes, if we dig deep down, I believe we can find the capacity to be able to send these forces, back across the borders.
Jasmine, all right, okay, thank you. Jasmine, I'm trying to look at the attack, of the Islamic State in Mozambique. That has been on the $60 billion project by Total in Cabo Delgado. That project is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, in Africa. So how much do foreign governments influence security on the continent?
I think it's a very good example, which links up to what has just been said. I think the Mozambican insurgency is a prime example of where there were early warning signs from 2017. And look where we are standing today. And the media narrative being run like that it's an Islamic State-led insurgency is completely incorrect. They do have their eyes on the insurgency, but they're truly not leading that insurgency. But what we are sitting with is a government in Mozambique simply not willing to admit to the local issues. And even if admitting to the need for regional support, and you sit with SADC, in itself, you are having different narratives at play. There is simply no SADC strategy at this moment in terms of what must be done. And if all the eyes on the technical committee now being deployed, don't hold your breath. I don't expect an in-depth report. And also from the government side, there remains a reluctance to compromise on sovereignty, which is providing a convenient shield. And what is happening, sir? We're talking close to 800,000 IDPs. It's a human calamity that this region has never seen before. And yet we are sitting with all these red tape processes and not knowing what to do and how to do the situation. And in the meantime, Britain steps in, France steps in, the United States steps in, Portugal steps in, all with these wonderful ideas. But those are silo interventions that will make no difference to the insurgency at play at this point in time. And yet it is the civilians that suffer.
I want to weigh in I want you to weigh in on what Jasmine has just highlighted. But again, if you look at it critically, the penetration of insecurity to other countries raises the questions of porosity of borders and the infiltration of small arms. How does a country like Nigeria avoid such problems? It's been relatively secure for now.
Well, when you say relatively secure, again, all of this is going to depend on the way we do the analysis. All of this has been building up for quite a long time, and this is a result of the more or less insecurity that has been happening for quite a while now. So being able to, counter this is going to take some time as well. And this is the big question: how much time do we have before this falls apart completely? I keep saying that we're just going to have to pull our socks up, because it is a great opportunity for leadership to arise within the African continent, because for quite a long time we seem to have been involved in some game of chess where you have various colonial powers intervening or pulling the strings behind the scene. So now we have ECOWAS, we have the AU. These are organizations that are really going to have to, get into the midst of this and really come up with practical solutions. And we have to keep in mind the limitations that we have, because you pointed out the issue of resources, wherewithal, how much is that? Then again, what about the political courage to be able to act? Because sometimes we're just caught up in politics, and we are becoming more and more victims of this, and that lack of moral courage sometimes to be able to do the right thing. But again, I like to be the optimist, to believe that it's a great time for leadership to arise, and for voices to come out to speak very clearly in terms of how African nations must cooperate or suffer. That's the fact, because we cannot have that luxury now of not being concerned about what's happening across the region. One failed state next door is a problem that's knocking on our own door. So cooperation is definitely the way forward for me.
Well, Jasmine, you call it democracy or call it a system that works. Do you think that having a well worked out system of government on the continent that wouldn't give any African leader, more than 10 years to be on the saddle, can also be one of the ways to bring about peace on the continent?
I do think that, and I want to agree, one has to be the optimist. And if you would allow me to respond, and I'll come back to your question.
No, go ahead.
If one listens, for instance, to the interviews from people in Mozambique, there is one message beyond the Western media propaganda, where it was all about how people suffer. It is the resilience of African communities. Their resilience that, irrespective of losing everything, where there is simply no hope, they create hope. In Mozambique, more than 80% of IDPs are being taken care of Mozambicans. That tells us something about our continent, and that tells us about where our solution lies. So, is an election process going to make a difference the way elections are being held now? Let's be honest and frank. It is not going to make a difference, for we know how the standard being set for free and fair elections are adjusted and aligned to interests of certain states at play. We need to revisit democracy and the integrity of democracy and listen to the resilience of these communities, and we will be pleasantly surprised on how much we can get and how much we have already available. But for as long as they kept quiet, and we have elitists making enormous profits to serve their own interests, sadly to say, these voices will never be heard. There, I believe, a drastic turnaround is needed.
So I actually wanted you to also weigh into back to the question I asked, because that's your response to Ohai's. I wanted you to weigh in looking at the years. We have quite a few African leaders that have stayed for over 2 decades. Do you think that's also a possibility, that a possible cause, so to speak, to the problem of insecurity in those areas?
I think one has to be careful here, because we are again bombarded with a narrative that either 2 or 3 year terms, that's enough. We need a change because that will indicate consolidated democracy, and that will enable certain levels of freeness and fairness. I'm sorry, I haven't seen that. I don't think that it must be linked to a specific term. I do think at the end of the day, it relates back to the responsibility of the leader in play towards the people that have voted and re-voted for him in an environment where we would hope it is free and fair. And if a nation decides to vote for the same person in a free and fair environment, who are we to say that it can only serve 2 or 3 terms? Why not 10 terms? If it benefits the people, if it benefits the region. I do not understand the obsession with years being coupled to a leadership to account for how consolidated a democracy is.
Okay, Jasmine. Okay, where does Deby's killing place African leaders? Are they in danger as well?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
You know, looking at the killing, the very unfortunate killing of Idriss Deby, does this also place some other African leaders in danger?
Well, I would expect that it might increase the threat level for some of the governments, because it does give other groups an indication that such things are achievable. So you might find some of the groups start to consider, taking more action. So definitely, it's worth considering. And I had said earlier that we need to start to do a whole lot of analysis in terms of how this one single event could affect everything else, because it's like a whole of cards, and the domino effect. So one thing affects everything else. So we just have to go back and to look at the entire scenario and continue to monitor it based on the strategy we already have in place. And people meet at the different levels. We've talked about meeting at the diplomatic level, but again, also with security forces, also meeting and reassessing their strategies in place.
Quickly, closing comment from you, Jasmine. What's the future of Chad? What kind of Chad are we likely to see in the days ahead?
In the days ahead, I think we must all prepare ourselves. The African region is confronted with various issues, but let's always remain sober. The European state form history has not been smooth. The Russian form state history has not been smooth. It is not going to be smooth for Africa. Let's not be fooled by counter narratives out there portraying an image, neglecting how they've struggled. Let's take up our struggle. Let's deal with the issues at hand. Let's listen to the civil society and the local communities. Let's address their needs. And at the end of the day, let's have a leadership in place that is willing to take up massive challenges so that we can enable an Africa that can tap into its resources and become a strong powerhouse.
All right, Jasmine Opperman in South Africa, Ohaya Kigbe in Lagos, Nigeria. Many thanks for being such a nice company on the show. We'll take a moment. When we come back, we'll continue our look on the implication of this very, developing story in Chad with Kabir Adamu. Stay with us. Well, it's a home stretch here on Village Square Africa here on News Central Television, and we're looking at the developing story in Chad. Joining me now is Kabir Adamu. He's also a security consultant. Good to have you join me, Kabir.
Thank you, Suleiman. Good evening.
Let me start by asking how you received the news of the death of Idriss Deby as a security, expert.
With extreme shock. I've been following developments in Chad, and of course, after the election, well, before the elections, we were aware that there were a lot of agitations by especially the opposition party and several other players who complained that the space was not free and fair, and that there was suppression by the ruling party, and in particular by Idriss Deby. I had also followed closely developments from the northern part of the country in its border area with Libya, where this rebel movement appeared to have gained some momentum as a result of the issues that were associated with the election. I was also following the developments when precisely on Friday last week, we heard that this particular rebel faction had made an incursion almost 200 kilometers close to N'Djamena, the capital. And I followed developments closely when within N'Djamena, we saw a lot of shops and residents, worried, some closing down shop and all that. And I also followed closely when there was an announcement by the Chadian military that they had succeeded in repelling the rebel incursion, and that in the process, 5 of their colleagues, soldiers, had been killed, and that over 100 of the rebels had also been killed. But then, interestingly, I also had the announcement by the FACT rebel group that they had injured President Deby. Now, the fact that I didn't hear President Deby coming out to issue a statement, or as usual in its usual traditional manner, issue some form of broadcast where he would be seen and he would praise the conduct of his soldiers, made me very, very worried. And of course, when the announcement came this afternoon that he was dead, of course, all of that sort of came into place. Quite a very, very unfortunate and significant development in the Sahel.
Well, earlier before you came on, I had conversations with our other 2 experts across the continent, Jasmine Opperman in South Africa and Ohai Higbe here in Lagos, Nigeria. They also on the same, page with you, saying that this spells doom for the continent. So what does that, when we talk about doom for the continent, looking at the Chadian situation security-wise for neighboring countries like Niger and your country, Nigeria, what does this mean?
So, Suleiman, I'm not sure what perspective they raised their conclusion on that it spells doom for the continent. But one thing I know that has become obvious, and that I'm hoping that especially the multilateral agencies and our Western partners would speak on, is the truncating of democracy. As you're aware, a junta has been named, and that junta is to be headed by the son of late Idriss Deby, and that is in clear violation of the constitutional provisions of that country. Now, that for me is what spells doom for the continent. We have a president who ruled for 30 years, and now we're having his son take over, even though he's promising the transition over a 1 year, 6 months period. The fact that the constitutional provisions were not followed, and the fact that almost all our partners, the Western partners, including the AU at the multilateral level and neighboring countries like Nigeria, have sort of kept quiet about this abuse on democracy, is what would spell doom. Let's remember that the rebellion itself and the issues that President Deby faced were the result of governance. Most of his opposition or the rebels, dissidents, if I'll call them that, were crying or speaking against what they perceived as suppression and lack of political space for them to participate. So if we have a continuation of a military government, it appears those issues will continue. Now, for a country that has been under a civil war for more than almost 20 years. And of course, having such a situation, it would mean a continuation of those kind of civil wars and the impact that is having on the continent. If you look at the neighboring country of Libya, from where this latest attack was launched, it's the same thing that happened that led to the ousting and the killing of Gaddafi, all now repeating itself in Chad. So what lessons have been learned? Unfortunately for me, nothing. So that for me is what spells doom for the continent, the inability of African governments to listen to the voice of reason and ensure an improved governance, especially democracy and better participation, inclusion in governance generally. For me, that's what spells doom for the continent.
Well, perhaps I think I'll make it more lucid. Well, the word doom there is mine, but what they both meant is that it doesn't look good for the continent, what has happened. Now, if you look at it critically, you've also said something about Libya, which is very key here. Do you think that what has happened has some, hand of, small groups of, armed groups in Libya, plus some of those other terror groups, perhaps maybe Boko Haram, that have been, making a lot of trouble in Nigeria? Because looking at what has happened, you just reminded us of the announcement being made by the Chadian Defense Force of repelling the rebel group. But it would seem as if the rebel group has been working with some other mercenaries from the Libyan flank, as well as maybe those from the Nigerian northeast.
So let's remember that this particular rebel movement, the FACT, was formed in 2016, and it comprises mainly generals who, for some reasons, fell out with himself, now late Field Marshal Deby. They moved out from 2016 into Libya and then entered an agreement with General Khalifa. And not only that, he allowed them to operate, find a base in Libya. And so if you look at from 2016 up until now, they've had enough time to consolidate themselves. They're ex-generals, if I'll use that word. They understand the military setup in Chad. They've had reasonable time to regroup. They've had reasonable time to acquire, weaponry. They've also had reasonable time to study, if at all, any gaps within the Chadian security arrangement. Now, any dissident setup, it's very possible they've enlisted the support of mercenary groups. It's very possible that they may have this mercenary support from, name them, all of the groups that are operating within the Sahelian region. But then let's remember, this is a political movement. Even though they've not technically participated in the elections, they are calling for a political change within the Chadian political structure. And so I am very hesitant to conclude that they may have formed any alliance with an ideological group. The two ideological groups that are operating in the Sahelian region are either Al-Qaeda linked or the Islamic State linked. Those are clear ideological groupings, and I don't see the possibility of any linkage between.
Okay, let me come in here. You just said that perhaps maybe over the months or years of their stay in Libya, they just may have been able to see some gaps in the Chadian forces. These are critical questions there are critical questions I meant to say that must be asked. Have you thought of why the president was exposed to gunfire?
So yes, traditionally, late President Idriss Deby has been the type to, he's not the general that sits in the office. He's a general that is in the field. And a lot of people have criticized that. On the one hand, it's good for the motivation of the troops, but then very importantly, it exposes him. And this is exactly what happened. Even though there are suggestions and information coming out from Chad, which is yet to be confirmed, says that already his ADC has been arrested, and some would say that he's even been killed by the new leader of the junta. Other suggestions are saying that there are a part of his close protection team that were also fingered in what happened to him. So two things are very obvious. The rebel movement, appeared to have gained some sympathy. Now, whether that sympathy includes people within the close protection team of late President Deby, or it included politicians who, for one reason or the other, know about the movement of President Deby and perhaps may have whispered that to the FARC movement. What is clear is that it was his attempt to lead his troop from the war front that unfortunately led to his demise.
We'll come back to looking at the military onslaught there, but again, you also made mention of the constitutional breach there, which constitutionally should have given the leadership to the parliament to take charge, but by dissolving the parliament and also naming his son Mahamat as interim head of state, do you think Chad is now running the risk of a heavy insurgency?
Yes, definitely. And that was the point I was making earlier on when I said the issues around good governance are the root causes of the rebellion in Chad that has been ongoing for upward of 20 years. Now, if we're seeing a continuation of this military suppression, because that's exactly what is happening, and I'm shocked that the world is keeping quiet about it. It's a coup, one of the most I would say silent coups that has ever occurred on the continent. And if that is the situation, then it appears that the suppression that the rebels were crying against is what will continue. But then I'm hoping, and this is me hoping, that the new head of the junta will surprise everyone by carrying out a government of engagement. So as an example, before his dad died, one of the things that was on the table was an offer for some form of reconciliation, where he called on, because let's remember, the leadership of this junta includes some of his family members. One of the leadership is actually his nephew. So all of this is like a family thing. And if we see a government of engagement where these people are brought on board and discussions are held in form of a compromise, then the possibility of some form of an agreement would be reached. And that means we'd see a de-escalation of the tension. But if the suppression that led to the emergence of the rebellion continues, what a military junta is likely to do, then unfortunately, Chad will continue in this civil war that has lasted for quite a long time.
Now, let me bring this home, and that's Nigeria. And I think we've also had to engage you about the governor of Borno State, who's been more than twice or thrice attacked by, the terror group in his own state. What does this mean to leaders like himself who go to the theater of war, like Borno State Governor Babagana Zulum? How dangerous can this be?
Suleiman, it's as dangerous as death is. If you are a leader that I'm sorry to use this word, that is ready to die, then you go out in the field in a battle situation. If, for instance, you are a leader that appreciates the importance of what leadership, I mean, frankly, Chad would have easily dissolved, or a civil war would have escalated in Chad, where even the capital would have fallen as a result of the death of Deby. So that's one of the positive things. We saw a very quick transition, and we must commend the military for that role in terms of organizing a very quick transition and preventing a breakdown of law and order. So that's one thing that leaders who take this type of action should remember. You can only lead when you are alive. You can't lead when you are dead. And unfortunately, most instances, death creates more problems than when leaders are alive. A good example is Libya itself. We've seen what happened after, despite all the criticisms against Gaddafi, we have seen what his death has created, and they were still living the consequences of his death. So the second thing I want to emphasize is that a protective security team is called that not just for fun. every executive, every leader has a protective team, that he should listen to that protective team. If a leader appoints a good and competent executive protection team, he should allow them to do their work. Their work is to protect him and keep him alive. If they say, don't go to a particular location, he should listen to them. And but then he has to appoint good ones. Unfortunately, what we have seen in Africa and in most other locations is that either they are appointed or sometimes they are cronies, and competence sometimes is not really the issue, but affiliation is the issue. So again, I must emphasize that point. There are trained protective security teams. Some of them have certifications, and I think it's absolutely important that African leaders learn to appoint competent persons in that capacity, and then to listen to them when they advise them about going to places and what to do when they go to places. I'm shocked sometimes, even the barest of protective gear that is meant to limit injuries, I don't see some of our leaders wearing when they go out to this type of locations. So again, there are so many things that we can talk about with regards to the kind of risks that some of our leaders take. But I would summarize by saying that the field of executive protective cycle and protection is a huge field, and our leaders should learn to allow experts to lead their teams when it comes to executive protection.
Now let's talk about Nigeria, because in all of this, Nigeria and even the Niger Republic have more or less been exposed, knowing full well that the late President Deby has been very, very audacious in the fight against terrorists and bandits. So what should Nigeria be doing at this point in time?
Well, number one is to ensure that Nigeria plays its role as the regional superpower. Yes, Chad is not in Africa. However, the proximity of Chad to several conflict zones in the continent and the impact of those conflicts on Nigeria makes it imperative for Nigeria to engage closely with development, especially multilateral bodies, including the AU and several others that would have a say. France too, I've been waiting closely to hear the response of France. So Nigeria would need to engage closely. As you know, the headquarters of Operation Barkhane is in Chad. And so it's very likely that France would issue a statement very soon on all of this development. I'm also watching closely to see what kind of impact the fact that France, if they wanted, would have stopped what happened, but then, I mean, they didn't. So there is a lot of conspiracy theories out there. Nigeria would need to play a leadership role in all of this. And more importantly, with regards to the multinational joint task force, as you know, the headquarters of the multinational joint task force is also in Chad, and President Deby has played a critical role in the formation as well as the operations of especially Sector 2 of the multinational joint task force. Now, that role would need to be continued. And one of the best ways to do that is for Nigeria to engage in bilateral discussions with the new junta to ensure that they play that role that President Idriss Deby used to play. Otherwise, a flank will be opened that the Islamic State in West Africa province particularly would exploit. Also, Al-Qaeda can exploit that flank, and before you know it, we have another stream of both weaponry and soldiers or troops or followers of these groups coming into Nigeria from that end. So it's absolutely important that Nigeria engages both bilaterally and multilaterally to ensure that the current successes that has been achieved with regards to the participation of Chad in several of these anti-terror operations, including the G5 in Mali, because sometimes Nigerians would think, well, it's Mali, it's not going to affect Nigeria. But let's remember that the Sahel is a long stretch, and the proximity, the distances that we're talking about are distances that are not only being exploited, but taken advantage of by these groups that are active there. So it's absolutely in our interest to continue with the engagement and to ensure that the government in Chad, the transition is stable, and that these groups do not exploit the vulnerabilities that may arise.
Kabir, this is actually sad and terrible and even hard times for the continent as it as it is losing one of the strongest leaders in the fight against terror. But again, security has been one of Africa's deepest and biggest challenges, and it is why it has been the highlight of our discourse here on Village Square Africa. We'd like to thank you so much, Kabir Adamu, for being such nice company, for unpacking this for us. We'll stay on this, and we'll catch you again on the show to help us unpack developing stories in Chad. Well, that's it on the square today. And of course, we'll stay on the developments in Chad and right here on the program. I'm Sulaiman. See you again. Bye-bye.